Systemic investing is sort of a new term. It's this idea of making coordinated investments across asset classes in order to drive a system's change. In this case, energy transition is what we're talking about.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Connecting the Dots. Today's podcast will explore how systemic investment and systems thinking can accelerate a global and just energy transition. Drawing on Dr. Jason Jay's expertise in climate strategy, institutional coordination, and sustainability leadership, we aim to dissect why piecemeal efforts are insufficient and how a more integrated approach informed by climate modeling, insights, and real-world case studies can bridge the gap between lofty decarbonization goals and on-the-ground progress. Today's guest is Dr. Jason Jay, who is a director of the MIT Sloan Sustainability Initiative. Hello, Jason. How are you?
Doing well, Emeka. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for your time. And just from what I know about you and from all the work you've done, you spent a lot of time on working on the En-ROADS and C-ROADS modeling. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So at MIT Sloan, we have this discipline called system dynamics, which is where we can build computer models of complex systems. And it's been a long tradition in particular to look at the economic and environmental dynamics of energy systems as part of that. I am not personally a modeler, but I work closely with the teams that develop these simulation tools, and I do a lot of teaching and facilitation around them to help develop climate strategy and policy for investors and companies and policymakers. What we've tried to do is to create free, open source, usable tools that help people understand these big, complicated issues around climate change.
Thank you. And from what I understand, you'll be showing us a bit of a demo on both simulators.
Yeah, and what I want to do is just frame up this context of energy and climate in the African context and situating that within the global moment that we're in. So first off, we have two different tools which your listeners can access on their own for free. Just a matter of Googling and you'll find it. This one is called En-ROADS, which is a energy rapid overview and decision support tool is what it was originally called. And what you can see here is that this is a simulation tool for exploring the future of the 21st century, right? So it goes from the year 2000 to the year 2100. And this is a picture of the whole world. Like, how is the whole world using energy? How is the whole world emitting greenhouse gases? And then what's the result of that in terms of the temperature? And then we have a bunch of different levers that we can pull, these different sliders down here that will, that kind of instantly change the situation and allow us to explore pathways for action and climate futures. And then the other tool that is called C-ROADS, which is a simplified, is a simpler model in some ways, but it particularly allows us to explore this global context about what happens if different countries and different groups of countries move in paces on the climate challenge. So you and I can have a conversation here to kind of set up this topic of climate energy in Africa, and we can go to these tools to explore and gain some insights about it.
Oh, great. And I think one conversation that always comes up when we talk about climate change is Africa only contributes 2% of emissions, and the West is pushing Africa to do all sorts of things around energy transition and things of that nature.
Yeah.
What are your views on that?
Yeah, it's a great comment and a great point. So we can see this in this picture here. So what you on the left here, we've got greenhouse gas emissions by region. And so you can see the pathways of emissions for all these different groups of countries, right? So the US is in red, the EU is in green, other developed countries, which includes Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the UK, and so on. And then you've got China and India in this sort of magenta color, and then the other developing nations. And the other developing nations includes Mexico, the nations across Africa, Central and South America, South and Southeast Asia. So there's a lot here. It doesn't separately break out Africa. But what you can see is that when we were talking in the year 2000, let's say, if you think about the population that's represented around the world, most of whom live in developing countries or emerging markets, you can see that it's not a huge amount of greenhouse gas emissions. However, the picture is changing as economies grow. And so you can see the rise in emissions that's been occurring as these countries industrialize, as they build out coal-fired power plants, as people get access to cars and electricity. All of which is great news because there's a lot of people who have been left behind by industrialization in the global economy. But the first thing is that to notice that there's a difference between the historical emissions and the future emissions. So it's
Mm,
100% true that the historical accumulated emissions of O2 the early industrialized countries, right? So for example, if we pull up let me pull up these data from Our World in Data, which is a useful data source. If we look at the historical contributions of who has warmed up the climate so far, it's very clearly the earlier industrializing countries, right? So it's the history of North America, the EU, China, some of these kind of rapidly industrializing countries. And then if we get down to Africa, right, this 3% of historical emissions is absolutely kind of your point that
yes, it is.
that we've created the problem in the global north, in the, former colonizers, however you want to think about it. And it's also the case that looking ahead, what's happening is that as these developing countries grow, they start to become a more and more significant contributor of emissions. And that's the interesting kind of collision here because the if we look at where the climate is going, which is this 3.3 degree sort of future, that's a world in which we start to face some really significant dangers. And so it's a really tricky conversation to have because the historical emissions have been from the global north. The future emissions are coming from the developing world. And all of us are affected by this. But in particular, a 3.3 degree world is very dangerous for people in emerging markets, right? So if we look at, for example, the number of extreme heat days, which has all kinds of health consequences, it's exactly
Yeah.
in the tropical latitudes that we're going to see, the frequency of those extreme heat days from where we are right now to
Oh,
the future, becoming more and more intense, right?
oh wow, that's really insightful. Hmm.
It's exactly in and if we look at deaths from extreme heat, which is, again, there's a lot of uncertainties in these models, but these are the sort of scientists' best guesses, is that they're Southeast Asia, Southern Africa, but also Southern Europe and Central Europe start to have really extreme heat stress.
Yeah.
And
Mhm,
so these are consequences that we're all going to be facing if we look at droughts, right, the loss of rainfall that our crops need, if we sort of zoom in here a little bit on sub-Saharan Africa, and we pull, so this is in the year 2000, and there, in any given sort of period, the likelihood of a more than a year-long drought, so a multi-year drought, is 11% to 50%. As we go toward the later part of the century, you start to see almost 100% likelihood of these
my
multi-year
goodness.
droughts that can really significantly affect crop productivity and therefore food availability and
Really.
therefore conflict, right? Because we know that migration and conflict. So we're all in this situation now where climate change is going to affect all of us. It's particularly going to affect people in tropical and emerging markets. And while the historical cause of that is clearly the emissions of US, EU, and China, when we look forward, it's the emissions, it's the growth of those industrializing emissions in emerging markets that are very heavily driving the picture. So we have to figure out so for the sake of Africa has to decarbonize. It's not just something that is sort of being asked of. So and the historical responsibility of the West means that we have to do whatever we can to assist and support and like be part of the solutions in the process.
Mm, that's really insightful, and also just from your last points around what the West can do. Obviously, when you go to COP and all these conferences, you hear about the loss and damage fund and all these funds that should be created to
Mm.
assist in this conversation. And I think those things are finally being put to play. But it seems like from just where I'm sitting, there's a lot of inaction
Mhm.
amongst African nations and among other nations in the global South. What's the strategy to get them to get
To
to
move.
work? Because these numbers are very, very scary. If you're going from
Yeah.
teens' likelihood of a drought to almost certainty of a multi-year drought, this should
Yeah.
be concerning to everyone involved.
Yeah, I am not in any sense or imagination an expert on the geopolitics or the diplomacy of this and what, it takes to get governments mobilized. I think there is a role here for awareness and education and people just understanding, wow, we really cannot afford to have a 3.3-degree future. That is a very dangerous climate future. And if we can change the course and get ourselves to a safer climate future, it's really essential for the thriving and survival of everyone, but particularly in these tropical latitudes. I think awareness building about climate physical risks is super important. And it's very hard to do because of the timelines here, right? We're talking about multi-year droughts becoming almost a certainty, right? But when is that happening, right? That's happening a decade or two away. Now, if you're in South Africa, you're worried sooner. But and people have very immediate concerns like, the conflict in the Congo right now or food on the table right now. It's hard to think about 10, 20 years from now. So that's tricky, that's real. But I think the reality is that we are in the period of consequences already. And we're already seeing these disruptions occurring. And so there's one part of this, which is just awareness of the science and kind of the waking up. The second part of this, I think, in terms of mobilization is just people understanding that it is actually a solvable problem. A lot of times we don't have hope. These issues seem so big, so far beyond us, and so out of reach that we don't think there's a possibility. But the other thing that we've learned, by bringing people together to explore and play with these tools, is that in fact there are certain actions that can be very powerful in moving us forward, right? So being really efficient in the way that we use energy, for example, is a great set of levers because it allows us to just not have to use as much energy to achieve the
Mm-hmm.
socioeconomic objectives, right? So how can we, especially, so for example, like we're going to need to cool our buildings to be able to keep ourselves safe from some of these extreme heat. Well, if we build our buildings so that they're well insulated, so that the air handling systems are very efficient, all of those things can help us a lot, in taking some of the strain off. And then we know that there are certain things like putting a price on carbon that can be very impactful, where you make polluters pay for the damages that they're causing, and then that changes the economics so that we move from high carbon sources of electricity like coal to, lower carbon sources of electricity like renewables and nuclear. And by the way, these types of policies, these types of actions can make a big difference, not just on the climate, but on the breathability of our air, right? So these types of actions can have a major effect on the air pollution. This is the kind of air pollution that really causes health harms. So if you're in
Mm.
mega cities, right, you're starting to, whether you're in, Lagos or Kinshasa and so on, we're starting to see that air pollution mounting like we have in India or in China. The health benefits alone and the economic productivity benefits of cleaner, healthier air start to almost pay for these types of
Mm-hmm.
action. The tricky thing is the reason that carbon prices work is because they make energy expensive. They get people to be more energy efficient, and to transition away from other forms of lower carbon forms of energy. And so this increase in the price of energy to consumers who are low income or coming in low income countries, that's a justice issue and a problem. And this is something where some of this cross subsidization matters, right? Like, so if we are paying a carbon price in the US or Europe, we have to be careful that and then we say, okay, therefore Africans should also be paying a carbon price. We have to be really careful about that distributional aspect, which is one of the real challenges here. But there's some interesting mechanisms, and I think what you were talking about the funds, not just loss and damage funds that fix the problem after we've broken things, but funds that actually invest in lower carbon energy in Africa as a way of almost creating a carbon offset or displacement. I think that's an important set of ideas.
No, that's
It is entirely possible to have a safer climate future if we, just reduce some of the leakage of methane, if we reduce some of the agricultural emissions, if we protect, critical forests, without any magical technological breakthroughs, we can create safer climate futures. And you can start to see, for example, some of these, like this drought likelihood being a bit better than it would have been in the high carbon case. So
mm,
I think there's an imperative to act. Now, how we actually get that done is a big question. I think that's the terrain that I want to get into, is if the world's energy system changes to look from where we are in 2020, where it's largely a coal, oil, and gas world, to 2080, where it's a significantly more renewable world.
mhm,
That's a great vision because of the lower pollution and everything else. But getting solar and wind and geothermal and hydro to be built on the ground and to work is tricky, right? Um,
mhm.
you and I have
Yeah,
talked about this a little bit about offline, and I think bringing your perspective to bear on this is really important in this conversation. Is, a lot of this is about efficiency and just using less energy, but to the extent that we're building stuff in the energy system, what you can see here is that the real growth is in the renewables sector.
I see
Um,
that. I,
here's another view of that, where you can see just like the growth of renewables is critical to any of these climate scenarios. So how do you get this done? And what barriers do we face, and how do we overcome those barriers? That becomes a really critical question in any context. I mean, it's
mhm.
hard to get renewables built at scale here in the United States as well as in sub-Saharan Africa. So how to and that's where this some of these topics about coordination and systemic investing end up coming into play.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Jason. From being involved in the energy space over the last decade or so, the last 4 or 5 years, you heard a lot about carbon trading, carbon investing, and start having conversations around the energy transition plans. And they then added the just energy transition plans across as something that was important across the value chain. And you really saw countries take the lead to create their own plan to show how they were going to move from X to Y. And the graph you just showed is an interesting one, because that really shows that countries, in order for us to get to the where we need to go, they have to invest in renewables and do it now, because renewable projects don't take a year or so. They take a lot of planning and a lot of strategy to ensure that you're actually going to get the output that's required. From an
Mhm.
energy transition point of view, and even on a global scale, what does that look like? Are countries actually putting their plans in place and pushing those through? And then just coming down to Africa, is there someone that you think is it the multilateral banks, is it a regional body to help coordinate this conversation so it becomes joined up, not just one that's focused on a particular side?
Yeah. Okay. So a couple things. One is that if we want to build up the capacity for renewable energy, one thing that's really strongly working in our favor, and actually let me come back to this picture here, is that renewable energy is by far the cheapest option, and it's getting cheaper and cheaper by the day. So here's the marginal cost of low carbon electricity production. I mean, what you've seen is this astonishing fall in the cost of solar electricity and in the cost of wind electricity. And those are going to, those are continuing to drop on a kind of an exponential basis out into the 2040s in this low carbon scenario. And even without any of these more aggressive policies toward climate action, if we actually like take all of these actions off, we just go back to that sort of more dangerous climate future. Even in that world, there's still a significant improvement as we deploy more and more of these technologies. There's learning that happens in the production, there's economies of scale, and it just gets cheaper and cheaper. So there's one thing is just that this becomes more and more inexpensive. Just the raw, building solar panels, building wind turbines. And so as a result, we've seen certain things happen. Like Pakistan, for example, has had this massive surge in purchasing and installation of rooftop solar panels because of essentially overproduction in China and extremely low cost solar. And so you have this major growth of the solar industry in Pakistan over the last few years. And so that's an example of where in an emerging market, some of this stuff is getting deployed. Um, the tricky thing is that sometimes the sun doesn't shine, sometimes the wind doesn't blow. And
Mm-hmm.
so you can't just build the panels and the turbines. You have to have the ability to coordinate energy flows in the grid when it's intermittent. So you can't just invest in the panels and stuff. There's also the energy storage. And energy storage, which is what lets you take in energy when the sun is shining and then redeploy it through the night. That might mean batteries. It might mean pumping water up a hill. It might mean pumping air into the ground. There's a bunch of different kinds of energy storage. But energy storage could end up getting really expensive as we deploy more and more renewables and therefore have more demand on storage systems. And this is one of the reasons why people talk about, well, if we had more nuclear energy that was more of a baseload power, then you don't have as much need for storage to get supply and demand to match up. But the key is that it's not just the panels, or the turbines, it's also the storage. And it's not just the storage, it's also a grid that is smart enough to be able to direct traffic essentially, right? And to get electrons flowing in multiple different directions needed to match supply and demand. And that means that you need coordinated investment in the panel, in the production, the panels or the turbines or the dams, the storage, so the batteries or the pumped hydro, and then the transmission infrastructure that's capable of handling that more complex flow of electricity. And so, it's kind of like the analogy of electric cars. If you can sell electric cars, but if there's no charging stations, people won't want the cars because they don't have a place to charge them. And if you just deploy the charging stations, there's no business model until people have the cars. So you have to sort of coordinate the ratcheting up of the charging and the cars together. And the analogy here is that you have to coordinate the investment of the grid infrastructure and the solar, wind, and storage capacities. And so that's where this like you use the term joined up, right? Like we need this kind of joined up coordinated approach to those investments. And then the question becomes, well, if it's just a bunch of entrepreneurs who are running around completely independently trying to build mini grids or microgrids or community solar scale installations and things like that, we probably break things. Like we probably don't get to have that coordinated approach. In some countries, you have this really top-down driven approach, like in China, where the Chinese 5-year plan sort of coordinates investment in these things. But in countries where we're not going to do that in this kind of more top-down governmental way, is there some other entity that can
Means to do that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And development banks, like you mentioned, might be interesting. There are certain private infrastructure investors like Encourage Capital who have played a role in that type of coordination work in India, for example. But this is, I think, a really important question. In part, not only do we need that on the ground coordination within any one particular country or region to do the grid and production and storage investments together. But if we want to fund this from some kind of north-south capital flow, if we want to finance this with some kind of north-south capital flow, there's also the coordination needed at that level, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where I start to say, okay, development banks have got to play some kind of an important role here, whether those are more, kind of global players like the IFC or, more kind of regional players like development banks that might or originate from African funds or
Yeah, well, like the ECOWAS of this world, or the African Union, or even the African Development Bank. Yeah,
yeah.
they definitely got a role to play. Just from one question around the coordination that's really important is, and also around energy transition, is in Southern Africa especially, you've got a really large dependency on coal.
Mhm.
And it's one of the, as we saw in En-ROADS, and as I learned in classes, that coal is one of the most powerful levers to push in order to get to decarbonization going. So, from a
Mhm.
systems view, how can we support these regions, especially in emerging markets of Southern Africa and parts of Northern Africa, to manage this just transition away from coal and towards
Yeah.
renewables?
It's a really good question. So just to come back to En-ROADS here for a second, right? So this dark band here is how much electricity we're generating from coal globally. It is the most carbon intensive fuel, so it's a major contributor to this fossil fuel CO2 and therefore ultimately the temperature. One thing that people have been talking about is, and I'm just going into the detailed settings here for different kinds of levers we could pull, but this is a really interesting lever, this one called reduce new coal infrastructure. So this is the idea saying, what if we just stop building new coal plants, right? So we're not talking about
Mm-hmm.
turning off the lights. We're just saying if there's a moratorium on investing and building out new coal plants, that might be an agreement among financing entities, including development finance institutions. The Chinese infrastructure banks have been a source of capital, but they're worried about climate. Like you could imagine some kind of thing that just says, okay, look, the coal plants are providing electricity and that's important. But if we just said, let's stop building any new ones, then what happens is that, and you could have let the existing fleet age out. Then what happens is that you kind of do this gradual phase down of the global coal industry as the plants age out, because the coal plant lasts about 40 years or so. And then what you're doing is that as those coal plants are phasing out, but you still have to meet rising demand, you end up filling that demand with gas and renewables and maybe some, diesel, if the only thing that you did was just this kind of moratorium on coal. The interesting thing about that idea is that it does have some effect on the climate. It does help us 2/10 of a degree, but the reason that people would do this, the real selling point for this would be on this air pollution bit, right? Is that
Okay,
most of the worst air pollution comes from
that's
coal.
cool. Yeah, makes
Right. And
sense.
so the lives that are saved here and the quality of life and the asthma and everything else and the productivity, that this is the selling point for that idea is to just let's just, stop building new coal plants, let the old ones age out, let new infrastructure come in. And then if you say, okay, now on top of that, in a sense, the carbon price partly achieves that. Now you've got a system that's like a little bit more reliant on oil and gas. So a scenario like this, some of the oil majors might really like this, there's still quite a bit of emissions coming from these oil and gas sort of sources. But, maybe you get more efficient in those uses of energy and maybe you get on top of the leakage of methane in those systems. And now you're starting to make a dent, a really significant dent in the climate problem and in the pollution problem. So I think that is a interesting, promising way. We just have to make sure that people still get to meet their energy needs in a growing economy, right? Gas has a role here as we've converted gas, we've converted a lot of coal to gas here in the United States. That's been one of the pathways. And so that might be an avenue. I think the key is to just remember that this is really the problem to solve is like, how do you, it's not so much about getting excited about renewables. It's about how do we shut the coal plants down. And the renewables are there to help us keep meeting demand as we do that,
Hmm.
but in an inexpensive way, because, as I showed before, the renewables are getting a lot cheaper.
Yeah, and I think the conversations around renewables is such a interesting one, given that Africa has a lot of wind, a lot of sun. But
Hmm.
if you look at what the region generates as far as solar, if you just focus on sub-Saharan Africa and compare it to Europe,
Hmm.
we're miles and miles behind on what that should look like. And it's from our research and our work we've done at Next Year over the last 15 years or so in the power sector. It really just boils down to the technology is just not there to push this things forward. We're struggling with SCADA, the smart grid to be able to really move this ahead.
Hmm.
As far as systemic investing goes, what are some strategies we can start to put in place to address that capacity gap? Because it's
Yeah.
obviously the fastest way to scale, given that the generation source is free, but there's all these limitations in place to before we're actually able to put these
Yeah.
generation plants online.
Yeah. I mean, this is why we are studying and advocating for this topic of systemic investing, right? So, systemic investing is sort of a new term, right? It's this idea of making coordinated investments across systemic investing is sort of a new term, right? It's this idea of making coordinated investments across asset classes in order to drive a systems change, right? In this case, energy transition is what we're talking about. Asset classes in order to drive a systems change, right? In this case, energy transition is what we're talking about. And systemic investing is a concept that has its origins in a couple of places. One is the European Union has something called Climate Kick, which is Climate KIC, Knowledge Innovation Center, which is a vehicle for funding climate innovation in Europe. They essentially commissioned this sort of research study and this question about how might we not just invest in particular startups or particular, solar projects or individual point solutions, but, how can we sort of drive these sort of systems changes? And Kirsten Dunlop, who's the CEO of Climate Kick, hired a guy called Dominic Hofstadter to think about that. And he created this manifesto essentially on systemic investing, and then has been working to build a field around this topic. And he and I do a lot of research and work together on this.
Interesting.
So there's kind of a government funding source of this to say, like, how can governments who have, flexible capital with the desire to achieve some mission, how might we create these sort of coordinated investment mechanisms? In parallel, there are private investors, impact-oriented investors, climate-oriented investors, who are saying, okay, we've had our share of minor successes of building particular climate tech companies, but we haven't really driven the whole scale change or transition. How can we take a more systemic approach to our impact investing? And the development finance community, development banks, and so on, the UN development program as well, they are also saying we need to figure out how to do this kind of these larger system changes. So there's a set of questions that everybody's asking right now about how do we do this kind of coordinated investment where we could help to get that technological infrastructure in place in the grid that could handle intermittent renewables together with the investment in the renewable capacity, together with kind of the other semi-intangibles, right? Because you also need a workforce that's capable of doing the installation and management and maintenance of all of this complex electrical equipment. And so maybe you also have to make another investment in community colleges or other educational infrastructure
Hmm.
to train up a workforce to do this. And then maybe everybody needs to understand the possibilities here. So maybe you need to fund some kind of public education campaign about climate and about the exciting possibilities of renewables. So you need the ability to be able to push on these multiple levers at the same time. This is not something the financial system is good at yet,
Yeah.
except when you have something like the Chinese 5-year plan as a coordinating device. So then how do we do this kind of systemic investing? And one insight, and so this is very early days. This inquiry has only been really moving seriously for the last 2 years or so. One insight that's emerged so far is that there's this critical role for what are called backbone organizations.
Precisely.
which is organizations that provide the coordination services essentially to say, okay, let's say that we wanted to do support energy transition in South Africa or energy transition in Nigeria. Well, let's use a Nigerian example. And we said, okay, first, we have to figure out what are the capital requirements to do this. Like if we were to upgrade the grid and if we were to install the necessary production of solar and wind, what would the total capital flows be that would be required, and what's the sequencing of that you would need? And then
So Jason, are these organizations government or private? Though I ask that because we just finished writing the integrated resource plan for the country of Nigeria as one of our projects. So
yes,
would this plan kind of fit into how that's done?
so it's a great question. So the way I would say it is that backbone organizing is like a set of services or a set of activities or
Mm,
set of practices. And it can be carried out by a variety of different actors and in a variety of different formats. So it could be a new, it could sometimes backbone organizing occurs from the funder. So let's say, a foundation or a government agency says, we're deploying capital here, but we're going to kind of get people together. We're going to do some of this coordination work so that we know that when we're deploying the capital, it's going to be in a joined up kind of way. In other situations, you're creating a new entity. That new entity might be a nonprofit, it might be a quasi governmental organization or a government organized NGO like a Congo or something what they call it, where
mhm,
there's some sort of a coordinating entity. Think about the Tennessee Valley Authority in the United States, which helped to do electrification of remote areas in the US, in the last 2 centuries. And so it can be a new entity. It can be sometimes an existing entity that is already has relationships with some of those existing stakeholders. So you could think about regional planning entities that already exist or independent system operators in the electricity space that are coordinating electricity flows in a particular region. They might be able to say, oh, well, we don't usually get involved in the coordination of capital flow and orchestration, but maybe that's a new task that we could take on. Right now we're sort of collecting butterflies of different
mhm.
sorts of backbone organizations, these different kinds of systemically oriented investing efforts, and we're just making a taxonomy of like what kind of butterflies exist in the world. We're far away from being able to say this is the best kind of butterfly. This is the most adapted butterfly to this particular context or the best tool for this job. We're not quite there yet. I think in the next month or so, we're going to release a paper on this topic of backbone organizations that at least lays out the options of how they can be structured and what the choices are that you're making when you're organizing them to get people to be kind of deliberate and mindful about that. It's going to be we don't have any sort of strong prescriptions. The thing that we do know, I would say, is I think we're starting to get a handle on these are all of the kinds of services that you might want to think about providing that you don't neglect the human capital. That turns out to be really essential, like whatever the training capabilities are. Well, Zoom just gave me a little thumbs up there. Don't neglect the human capital. Don't neglect the orchestration and coordination. That's kind of almost definitional to the back. Don't neglect the public awareness building and educational components. There's a key part of it, which is about data infrastructure. So, can you make a dashboard of the current state of play and then regularly update and publish that so that everybody can kind of see how are we doing against these goals, right? So that analytic and kind of shared awareness tools can be a really key role. Sometimes providing and engaging in policy advocacy to say, okay, there are certain things like pricing of carbon or phasing out of coal investment or combining a carbon market here with a carbon market somewhere else, like that would be enabling conditions, incentives that would be important for us all to succeed. You might think, oh, well, we're just trying to build grid, so why do we have to get involved with all this other stuff? But that's the key, is that these efforts break down when they're missing some critical component. And so I don't know. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this about who do you think is in the position? Like you said, is it a governmental planning body? Is it an industry association of some kind? Is it a grid coordination?
Yeah.
In the Nigerian context, which you know best, I think, how would it get done?
Yeah, so in the Nigerian context, you have the private sector heavily involved in the power space, except on the transmission end. So the government is still wholly involved in that, but government understands that for the sector to progress, transmission needs to be playing at the same level as the Gencos and the Discos. So from a Nigerian context, you would need a private body that has government backing in order to push some of these things forward. You have a play where the private guys are concerned about profits. That's their mantra, right? So, but you also know that if you don't have this backbone organization, a lot of projects are planned because government is still involved in some of the planning. So you need to get government to be involved. So I think it's private sector with a strong government backing to move things forward. I looked up the Tennessee Valley Authority when we initially talked a few weeks ago, and it's almost 100 years old. Started in 1933 and does work across all the southern states in the U.S. So it's a entity that they put together in order to create projects, and it's now scoped for just not just from power to things around flooding and a number of other issues. So I think those sorts of structures are possible to create, but it has to be done from a government that has the foresight to set this up. I think when we talked, I explained the Nigerian context of states are now able to generate, distribute, and transmit power on them by themselves. It used to be kind of on the exclusive list, which meant that it was up to the federal government. But now it's at the state level, and
Mhm.
states are working to get investment in, but who's going to put together these projects and put together these opportunities? It has to be some sort of organization that has the foresight and understands how these things work. But I think from just how the continent works, the ministers and the people at the federal level, the senators, presidents, vice presidents, are still very important in how these things are shaped. So if you had
Mhm.
the opportunity to advise, or what would be the first step if a country said, "Hey, Jason, we want to work on systemic investing," what's the
Mhm.
approach as obvious as it ties to energy transition?
Yeah, systemic investing for energy transition. It's a great question. I think that is the question we sort of sit with. I don't have an answer. I think that what we would want to do is look at examples of where this has happened successfully, right? If I just pull up, which countries have the greatest percentage of renewables, right? And where have we seen, and not just places where they built their whole electricity system on hydro from the beginning, right?
Hmm.
There's one modality here where it's like Norway and to some extent Canada, where you have a high percentage of renewables, but you've had them for a really long time because
You haven't changed. You're
you haven't
still
changed.
you've
You've
yeah.
built, right. So the more interesting examples are things like Sweden, where they've actually gone from a probably about doubled the percentage of energy that they generate renewably.
What about India? Would also
And
fit?
India, where are we at right now with India? The latest data in 2024 is that it's about 14% renewables. It's been
Okay.
increasing. That percentage has been increasing. India's building everything everywhere all at once, right? So they've got a ton of
Hmm.
solar and but they also continuing to build coal plants and they're also building gas plants. So that percentage is going up while the whole energy system has grown really substantially. And so that's not a bad example. Pakistan is a little higher. They're at 18%, I think, and that doesn't even include some of the more recent surge in solar. But Italy is a great example where Italy is now at 21% renewables, but that's up from
That's impressive. Yeah.
yeah, and that's a huge surge that you see in the last 20 years. And I think one of the things that's interesting is the in the Italian context, Enel, which is the Italian electricity company. So
Hmm.
it's a private company that was originally a state-owned monopoly and then privatized, right? And interestingly, operates around the world. So NL actually provides electricity services in Africa in certain countries and in a couple other places. So how did NL coordinate the investments in Italy necessary to get that jump to happen. They've been one of the most successful renewable providers globally. And what are they learning from their experiences in the countries outside of Italy where they're operating? I think there's something to be learned from these. I'm a big believer. There's a science fiction author called William Gibson, and he had this great quote where
Okay.
the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed.
Hmm.
He,
That's
and that's always been a mantra of mine because it's like we don't have to always invent things. We sometimes just have to go and find out who's already figured this out and then try to learn from them. And I think that's one pathway of inquiry here to say, how could we get systemic investing for energy transition done in Nigeria now? Well, let's look at how it was done in Italy, over the last 20 years, or, in Sweden or, in other places where it's happened. But then relevant to the African context, I think another question would be like, how did the transition to mobile telephony and mobile money happen, right?
mm,
In, in Kenya.
very organic, very
Yeah.
organic. Yeah.
Well, yes, and there was a key role, when Mustafa Tarab was at the World Bank, he worked in specific ways to deregulate the telecommunications sector in ways that were going to enable that decentralized effort to happen, right? He is now the CEO of the biggest phosphate mining company in the world in OCP in Morocco. But there were a couple of moves by key players that then enable this more decentralized effort to occur. And so what is the light amount of coordination that you have to do that then unleashes the market to do its magic? I think those are some of the questions that we could be asking. Now, mobile telephony may not be a good example because it can be so decentralized, right? You just build a tower
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
phones.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's not the same. It doesn't have the same degree of interdependence and like relational complexity that a grid does in that sense. So maybe, plumbing is probably a better analogy, right? How do you coordinate the deployment and development of plumbing and wash, sewage processing systems and things like that.
Hmm. Hmm.
This is what this emerging field of systemic investing is doing, is that there's simultaneously historians who are looking at how did these kinds of transitions happen in the past, efforts looking at right now, what are the requirements and who's around, what institutions are capable of potentially playing some of these coordinating roles,
Yeah.
and then trying to get involved in running experiments to say, well, how could we make this happen? And I think what I love about this conversation is I think we've pointed to a territory here, right? Which is and a question, which is like, who can provide the capital orchestration and backboning services needed to enable systemic investing into energy transition in Africa? And a lot of times the hardest part is just getting the right question. And I think we've got the right question. What I'm hoping is we can use this episode to help shake the bushes and see who might have some answers to it.
Yes, and that's really the goal, right? Because at the end of the day, one thing that's important is conversations are happening, but they're happening in very siloed arenas. So that's why you'll have someone to wake up and build a 200 megawatt plant without really thinking through who the off taker is, how this would go around the grid, and all sorts of things. And you start running into challenges. But yes,
Mhm.
you're right. We asked the right questions and we really put it in perspective. Maybe to get you out on this last question would be just around energy transition. The numbers for Africa are quite scary, and just how to really move this forward. What would your advice be if we are sitting in front of a minister around just specific on energy transition? What do they need to start doing in order to really push this as a national topic, not just something that you go to COP every year, you
Mhm.
discuss, you come back, and you go back to just status quo.
I mean, I think that this is nothing is going to happen if this is seen as coming from the outside. It has to be indigenously, locally kind of led, right? Like if it's like Greta Thunberg is telling us to do something is the answer to screw that. Like that's not how the conversation is going to go. But if there's people like yourself who are, in and of Nigerian energy system, and are saying, look, I've been playing with these climate models and I am scared. And I think that we've got a major problem on our hands. And any amount of finger pointing or blaming the historical contributions of the West, like the past is the past. If we look at the future, it's our emissions that are going to kill us. And so
Hmm.
we've got to just take the reins and solve this problem. And fortunately, the economics of learning curves and scale of economies of renewables mean that we can afford to do this. We just have to make the choice to move down this path. And if that message is coming from someone like me, who I've literally never been to sub-Saharan Africa, and I'm a white guy from Boston, like forget about it, right? So I think it's about, but what can I do is just try to, put these tools in folks' hands, help to build the conversation and help to develop local leaders and local universities and other capability to be able to have this conversation in a rich way, and then to advocate within my own context for us to get our act together, right? We've got plenty of problems back home here in the US in terms of retrenching on climate, and to get our people to say Africa's energy future is really important to all of our shared climate future. Like I've got enough work to do back where I am, right? So I think the messenger matters. I think the message is we're digging our own grave. Let's do something different is an important message. And if we want to do something different, we've got to do it together. We've got to do it in this joined up, coherent, coordinated way. And we need to create organizations like backbone organizations, or however you want to talk about it, that are capable of doing this coordinated capital deployment and capacity building, and with the legitimacy of the private sector and the public sector together. How are we going to do this? Let's keep learning from folks who are looking at this history and how this is playing in other places, but we got to get this done ourselves. That to me is the message. And again, the prize on the other side is air we can breathe. We get to keep.
Droughts, no droughts, you know.
Yeah, and just getting to create a thriving, vibrant future, which is what we all want, and not going down this route. I mean, you just go back and if you just go back and like look at the Industrial Revolution in England, right? It was horrible. Like people, there
Hmm.
were, Churchill had days in where people, they had to shut the whole city down. Nobody could breathe. People were dying. It was a toxic, smoke-filled hellhole for a while. And
Hmm.
if you look at the developmental trajectory of countries that have gone through the process since then, it doesn't have to look like that, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and so I think this idea of like, well, you polluted, so now it's our turn to pollute. It's sort of like, well, okay, like you punched yourself in the face, so now it's our job to punch ourselves in the face. Like this doesn't make any sense.
It's
We
not
had
gonna work. Yeah.
You skipped landlines and got to mobile telephony, and it's worked, and it's beautifully. And you skipped ATM machines and you got to mobile money, but ahead of where we did. So
Hmm.
let's, do the same with the clean energy system. Questioning some of these dominant narratives is a key piece of it.
Yeah, and just to add, one of the things that you mentioned is around empowering folks in the continent to have those very serious conversations, and the C roads and N roads tools are things that I've been playing with since I finished up at MIT, just to really understand how to have these conversations. So from a firm's point of view, we'll be looking to work with the MIT Sustainability Initiative around how to really educate the region on the importance of this. So I hope that's something that the initiative would be willing to do with us. And then also, we've got to get you out to Nigeria. I know you've been to North Africa, but you haven't been to Nigeria. So we've got to get you out here as well.
Exactly. Love it. It was great to catch up and provoke some further conversation among your audience.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks. Bye-bye.